At least 21 people are now known to have died in flooding across Central and Eastern Europe. A major low-pressure system over northern Italy has sent record amounts of rain across Austria, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary and Romania. So these are the rainfall forecasts for the next few days, with the heaviest precipitation marked in dark blue. With river levels still rising, evacuations are continuing.
The classrooms at this school in Romania should be filled with children at this time of day. Instead, their teachers are busy cleaning up the damage from days of flooding.
Last time we had floods, the water did not enter the school. Now we have no more laptops to work. My house is also flooded for the first time. I know how the children and their parents feel.
These books and toys at a nearby kindergarten were new just a week ago and are now destroyed. The county of Galați in eastern Romania was one of the areas worst affected by the floods that inundated Central and Eastern Europe. And as residents here come to terms with the extent of the damage, other parts of Europe are still bracing for the arrival of floodwaters. Here in southwest Poland, local residents are banding together to help police and the army build flood barriers along the Oder River and its tributaries.
We are trying to make it stable. There are leaks in some places, but we are trying to patch them up as soon as possible with sandbags, which people have been making here since this morning. I hope that we can keep the embankments as they are.
A race against time. Neighbouring parts of Poland have already been completely submerged.
Dr. Hans-Martin Füssel is an expert on climate risks and adaptation at the European Environment Agency and joins us from Copenhagen. Welcome to DW. Is it inevitable that flooding emergencies like we're currently seeing in Central and Eastern Europe will become more dangerous and more extended?
Yeah, that is, of course, a very relevant question that many people ask themselves, seeing those tragic images from different parts of Central Europe at the moment. Unfortunately, the climate-related risk, the risk of heavy precipitation, has been increasing due to man-made global heating, and it will further increase in the coming decades. So a certain increase in those hazards is unavoidable. However, we can always improve how we prepare for this situation in terms of how we use the land, how we set up flood protection and emergency services. And of course, it remains important to limit global heating so that the overall risks remain manageable.
It is interesting that if we take the example of Germany, where I'm speaking to you from now, in one of the flooding disasters that we had, we heard from an expert a little earlier today who said that in some areas, exactly the same buildings have been built in exactly the same place. So if exactly the same thing happens, we'll have exactly the same result. It seems like the message isn't necessarily getting through that we have to change.
Yeah, that is indeed an important point raised by the expert. I mean, one of the principles in life in general, and in particular in managing climate risks and other risks, is to learn from mistakes. And this is known as building back better after a disaster. And I mean, it's not the role of the European Environment Agency to look in detail of what countries are doing, but I understand from different conversations that there are still a lot of administrative constraints in place, maybe political pressure to rebuild quickly, also insurance-related constraints that indeed lead to the situation that you describe, rebuilding destroyed buildings in the same way in place as before the flood. So I would say if weather extremes enter a new territory, also administrative procedures and insurance solutions need to become more flexible to avoid just recreating a situation that was already dangerous and proven to be dangerous.
And I suppose we're not just talking about the loss of human life. What are your predictions for the effects of flooding on critical infrastructure and economic activity?
Yeah, that is a very important point. I mean, even just the economic damages from floods from individual events can be extremely high. You mentioned Germany. The estimates about the floods affecting Germany and also parts of the Netherlands and Belgium in 2021 are more than 40 billion euro in damages. I mean, that's extremely substantial. If you look 1 year back at Slovenia, where a significant part of the country was flooded, the damages there are between 10 and 16% of the national economic product. So basically, the work of around 2 months was destroyed overnight. And this can, of course, have long-term impacts on public finances, on insurance prices, on credit ratings, and so on.
Right.
So those major events can have significant impacts on the infrastructure, on the economy, and, of course, also human health.
Right. So as you look around the world, where do you see examples, perhaps, of best practice? Who should we be learning from?
Well, we're not using the term best practice in our EA context. We use case studies or maybe good practice examples. And it was interesting that the Netherlands was less affected in terms of economic damages and also loss of life than Germany and Belgium in the same flood. And of course, they have a long tradition in securing their country from water, both from the seaside but also from rivers. And for a number of decades, they have a program called Room for the River, which creates flood polders that can be flooded in extreme event and basically are a buffer when the river capacity is not sufficient. Of course, this is also implemented in other countries, but for instance, in Germany, there have been significant political discussions around building flood polders along the Danube. And if we look at very short-term intense rain events, so-called cloudbursts, then Copenhagen is also an example of a city that has learned from a very catastrophic such event in 2011. It is now transforming into a kind of sponge city, having more green areas, making sure water can be stored and can be channeled down to the sea. Copenhagen is a coastal city, of course.
I like that idea, a sponge city. And we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for guiding us through that. Hans-Martin Füssel from the European Environment Agency. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Well, the floods have also hit the Austrian capital, Vienna, but the city's resisting them. Here's a look at the massive flood defence system built in the 1970s and 80s.
Austria's capital, Vienna, wouldn't exist without the Danube River. But over the centuries, the city has experienced a series of devastating floods. Including in 1954, that inspired a massive geoengineering project, the creation of an artificial arm of the river, the so-called New Danube running parallel, a still body of water controlled by dams that in times of trouble saves the day. The Danube River is nearly 3,000 kilometers long and flows through 10 European countries. When it gets to Vienna, during normal times, it continues to flow along its ancient route. But if the water level rises too high, floodgates northwest of the city open up the New Danube, which can absorb the huge volumes of extra water. Southeast of the city, the New Danube joins the river, and the city stays above the water. The project was controversial and took 16 years to pull off. But the city got a bonus, the Danube Island, made of the earth that was excavated for the new river channel. Sheep graze here, alongside city dwellers out for relaxation. However, the city has not been completely immune to the most recent floods. A small stream has flooded in recent days, putting parts of the city underwater, but nothing like what would happen if the Danube overran its banks. The new Danube, a win-win situation for the city. One solution to buy time as climate change raises flood risks worldwide.
I want to bring in now Linda Speight. She's a hydrometeorologist specializing in developing early warning systems, particularly for flooding. She joins me now from Oxford. It's good to have you with us. I want to go from Poland to Austria. Vienna's flood defense system is said to protect the city even from a 10,000-year, once in 10,000-year flood. How would you rate the way it has held up in this most recent round of flooding?
Yeah, so Vienna itself is kind of built on a massive floodplain. It should be a big marshland system. So when we're talking about the flood defense system in Vienna, we actually mean the reason the city can exist there at all is because of civil engineering throughout history that has enabled the city to grow up there. So we have flood defences on the river Danube itself, which include a massive flood relief channel on the Danube island, which they've performed really well. There's not been big flooding from the Danube, but we have seen flooding from some of the smaller streams running through the city. And that's where I think we're starting to have this conversation about how well the flood defence system has worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, Vienna certainly can afford to invest in a major flood defence system, but are there lessons for smaller towns or cities who might not have the same amount of resources or public funding?
Yeah, definitely. So we've seen flooding from the smaller river channels in Vienna. And one of the reasons that that's taken people by surprise is those channels, they have no space. The city has grown up around them. We see the railway lines and the metro lines running directly alongside the river channels. And that means when the water overtops, there's nowhere for it to go. So what we're starting to see around the world is people opening up those culverted water systems, reconnecting the city to the green and blue spaces that should be in it, so that when the river floods, it doesn't come as such a shock that suddenly there's a great big torrent of water flushing through the city centre.
You know, in Central and Eastern Europe, there is a death toll from these floods. Are you surprised by the number? I think we're talking about between 17 and 19 right now. Are you expecting it to be more, or what would you say it tells us about the current state of flood defense systems in Europe?
Yeah, so this event was forecast quite well. We could see it coming in the weather forecast systems last week. It was really obvious that this was going to be a lot of rainfall and some really high river levels. So actually, I think the death toll's quite low. It's devastating for all those communities that have been flooded and have been impacted. But actually, the warnings were helpful. We could see proactive actions taking place, countries reducing reservoir levels so that there was more space in the system for water. And I think overall, the warning system has worked really well in this case. The problem is that the warning system is not designed for these massive, really big events that we don't see very often. Mm-hmm. So when we say to people, a big flood event's coming, it's very difficult for anyone to comprehend what that really means when they've not seen as much water coming down the rivers in their lifetime. And, seeing those footage that was just on your video reels there of roads being destroyed, electricity systems being cut out. It's hard to imagine that when you receive your flood warning. And that's the thing that flood warning specialists like myself need to work on now, about how we communicate how bad these events are going to be before they happen. If
you were an advisor to a mid-size town in Central Europe that is looking to deal in a more positive way with future flooding, what would you advise them that they should do first?
So I think a really important thing is just look at how the community works and think about what's going to happen when a flood occurs. It's not just those houses that are in the area where the water's going to be. It's the knock-on effects about transport infrastructure, hospitals, the whole community fabric of the area. So actually starting thinking about how those things link together in the community and how they will break down, and therefore what the best way to deal with those, what the real impacts are going to be on individual communities. And then you can design a system that can address those and prepare people for those. And the only way to do that is to work really closely and get everyone in that community involved in those discussions right from the very beginning.
Yeah, and what about our level, our sensitivity to warning systems? I dare say a lot of people would ignore warnings that come across radio, television, maybe even on your smartphone. What can we do to change that level of awareness, to be mindful of the warning and how serious it is?
Yeah, that's a real challenge, because what we don't want to do is scare people. We don't want to be pushing warnings out all the time saying something really bad's going to happen and people just stressing about it. What we need to do is help people understand that when these warnings are put out, then that's to help them prepare. So we should be combining warnings with proactive actions and helping people understand things they can do to reduce the impacts of the flood event. And if we can combine those warning systems with an understanding of how people respond to these type of events, then hopefully we'll be able to stop people ignoring them, because we've got really good technology and forecasting models and good science that's behind these warnings. So now we need to make sure that people take action on them when they receive them.
Yeah, it would be a shame not to use the technology, that's for sure. Hydrometeorologist Linda Speight, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.